It's time for us to start tonight. It's good to see everyone here. As you probably figured out, the air conditioner is not working. I can give you an alternative if it's too hot. It's the sun's coming in over there, so it's the thermostat's warmer on that side than it is on this side. And if you're really too hot and your phone has Zoom on it, you can go to the basement and sit in the basement and tune into Zoom. I think there's a few people at home that tuned in that way. So let's begin our class with a word of prayer, and then we'll start our discussion. Our dear holy and gracious Father in heaven, we come before you as a group of people, come to study your word, and thanks about your teaching tonight. Be with us as we open our scriptures and look at these things. May we learn things that will help our faith and help us to be better servants of yours. We ask you to be with those that are ill and could not be here. In Christ's name we pray, amen. What I'm doing tonight in the next couple of weeks is I'm going to give some highlights of the trip that Kelly and I took to Israel back in June now, that we went to Israel. And I'm going to give it, tonight's lesson particularly is going to be from the perspective of things that we learned and we saw that changed the way perhaps we looked at some things in the scriptures, because we saw something. You know, you always form in your mind what you think things were like. And then part of what you understand about the scriptures is what you formed in your mind. But when you go and see these things, and it probably helps us understand some of the things about the scripture. I'm going to focus tonight on the glory of God, because that's one of the most important subjects of the scripture, I think, the glory of God and how he relates to us through his glory, and the presence of the Lord, and particularly as his presence was demonstrated among the children of Israel. And that's going to cause us to look at Mount Sinai. We're going to look at the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle. We're going to look at the temple, and then we're going to finally look at Jesus coming to Herod's temple in the New Testament. This is very fortunate that we're kind of doing this tonight, because Kevin had a real good lesson Sunday in their Bible class from Ezra about the temple. So we're going to start at Mount Sinai. I guess I need to make a couple of caveats here before we begin. We don't know for sure where all of these sites in the Bible are, such as Mount Sinai itself. There are several possible locations. We have traditional locations, and most of the traditional locations, which is shown here in this picture, and this is on the Sinai Peninsula, and the monastery of St. Catherine, that's at the base of the hill, and this is traditionally what is considered to be Mount Sinai. Well, most of the traditional locations were identified in somewhere in the mid-300s by Constantine's mother, Helen. Constantine declared Christianity legal in 313. And so she wanted to build cathedrals or churches at all of the holy sites. And so she went around identifying holy sites. Well, even that day, many of the holy sites were picked from a group of possible sites. And so this is one of the possible sites as traditionally considered Mount Sinai. I will try to tell you when we feel very confident that the site is what, as I go through these next couple of weeks, when a site is actually the site, and when we think it's just a traditional site. But Mount Sinai, this is a traditional site there on the Sinai Peninsula. And of course, we know from Exodus 19 that Moses brought the people out of the camp. They were camped on Mount Sinai to meet God. And they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. So God's glory, God's presence was demonstrated to them physically at Mount Sinai that day when they camped around Mount Sinai. There they constructed a tabernacle, and this is a model of the tabernacle that's been constructed in the desert there, in the Judean desert. Now, they didn't have a tour bus sitting when they constructed, but you'll see there's a tour bus in the background. But this is a model that's been constructed to represent that. Of course, in the tabernacle, there was the Ark of the Covenant. Again, this is something to demonstrate the Ark of the Covenant. And the significant thing about the Ark of the Covenant was it represented the presence of God. And so for the first 40 years that they had the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, whenever the cloud would move, as it was over the Ark of the Covenant of the tabernacle, when it would move, they would break camp and move, and they would follow it. And whenever it stopped or wherever it stopped, they would set the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle underneath that cloud, and they would camp in order around the camp. So the presence of God, the glory of God controlled their lives, their action, or where they went, and it was always with them in a very physical manifestation in the ark, with the Ark of the Covenant and the cloud that was above them. And one other thing I wanted to mention there, for the next 450 years, they camped around, not just the 40 years in the wilderness, they had this tabernacle in the Ark of the Covenant, and I'm using 450 as an approximation. This was where they went when they wanted to come before God, the presence of God. And I think that's one of the things that it kind of came to light with me on this last trip, was how long they used the tabernacle and how long they came before it. For the first 40 years, they moved it throughout the wilderness and camped with it. When they got to Mount Oreb, and before they went over into the land of Canaan, they looked over and they were going to go into the land of Canaan. When they finally crossed, they camped at Gilgal, which was just outside of Jericho. Gilgal is one of those towns that we don't know exactly where it was. Our best guess, or traditional, is that Gilgal is in the plains near Jericho somewhere, and that's where they camped. And the tabernacle sat there 14 years at Gilgal while they went with Joshua and captured took control of the land and defeated many of the people. This is a picture from from Mount Oreb, looking over into the land of Canaan. And this area up here, I know this picture, there was a lot of fog that day, but in this plain over here, this is the Dead Sea, and this is where Moses and the children of Israel were. And they looked across, and Gilgal would have been in this plain somewhere, and Jericho would have been in that plain too. And you see, it was desert land. And we're going to have one of our lessons, we're going to talk more about the desert land along the, go back and look at this map. All this gray area here is very much desert land. And we'll see that Gilgal is down in that, and so is Jericho. Jericho is an oasis in the desert. It's called the City of Palms, an oasis in the desert. Okay, the tabernacle goes from Gilgal to Shiloh in Joshua, the 18th chapter. This is after they have initially subdued the land. And now Joshua, they go to Shiloh, they bring the The whole congregation assembled there, and they set up the tent of meeting. It's called the tent of meeting and the tabernacle. And the land was subdued before them, and that's where Joshua divided the land, and the people were supposed to go out and then finish driving out the Canaanites from the land. The tabernacle sat at Shiloh for 369 years. That's one of those other things that I didn't really appreciate until I'm standing there at Shiloh and he says the tabernacle sat here for 369 years. They had a wonderful hologram video there at the site there at Shiloh. And I tried to buy a CD of it, but they weren't selling CDs of it. I guess they wanted you to come to see their hologram, because I was going to bring it back and show it to you. But it's about from Gilgal up to Shiloh is about 30 to 40 miles that they have moved. And they've moved it from the plains, and this kind of yellowish area is the hill country. This is desert, and so there's going to be more vegetation, but it's rocky hills. This picture is a picture of what the archaeologists think is the tabernacle site in Shiloh. Since 2016, they never knew exactly where the tabernacle sat in Shiloh. There's been a group excavating there since 2016, and a fellow named Dr. Scott Stripling from the Americas University, and he has in his archaeological, he's an archaeologist, his archaeological season, they have about 150 people who come, and some of them are just what I would be a laborer who carries buckets of dirt. Some are sifters, and some are identifiers, and some are washers, and some are photographers, and some are recording and where it came from. But they've been working at Shiloh several years now, and the things that they believe this area right in here is where the tabernacle actually sat, because they have found a second thing they believe about this site is, since the tabernacle was there so long, it became a semi-permanent building. They built a stone foundation all the way around the tabernacle, and either set the side walls on the stone foundation, or they built walls full height and just put the roof of the tabernacle on it here at Shiloh. That information is both available from, or has been suggested by the archaeologists who have been there and excavated. It's a part of the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is a group of Hebrew writings or Jewish writings where they have summarized some of their traditions and their thinking about what went on, particularly between the time of the end of the kingdom and the first century, but it also goes back and references things such as this. And so in the Talmud, they reference that the tabernacle became a permanent building here at Shiloh. So they have found, as I say, they've found foundations and stones that conform to the shape of the tabernacle. They have found a place that conforms to the Holy of Holies and the holy place and dimension-wise. A second thing they found at Shiloh is they found large pits of bones. And these are not just ordinary bones. They're obviously sacrificial bones because they're all from clean animals. Most of them are from the right side of the clean animals. You go back and look at Law in Leviticus, the priests were to get the right side. So that indicates that there's the animals are clean animals, and that indicates that this was a Jewish sacrificial place. And so that, again, leads them to think that they have found where the tabernacle was, and that by the bones being there, and so it's of Jewish origin. I want to just here are shows some where they found some foundations around that, and where there would have been storage rooms or where the priests would live. And then there were, in the solid rock there adjacent to it, they have carved places in it where they might have set things or stuff or something like that. At Shiloh, there's an olive pressing station, and you put olives in here, and you had a wheel that I'll have a better one in another photo later, but you first initially crush the olives here, then you had this mechanism over here, you'd press the oil out of them. That would be significant for the priest, right? Because they used olive oil for many things at the tabernacle in their worship. Also at Shiloh, this picture is of a Byzantine church. Now, the Byzantine era was an era that was about 400 to 600 AD. It was after the time that Constantine had made Christianity legal, and Christianity by then had become the state religion, and the state began to build churches. So, that's the best thing Constantine, or the worst thing Constantine could have done for Christianity, was to make it legal. I won't, because they've got all of these cathedrals that they're building, the state is supervising. But this is significant here that helps us feel very certain about this site being Shiloh. Most of these early churches had mosaic floors, and they had different things, patterns or words or sayings in the mosaic tile with different color mosaics. This church here in Shiloh has the word Shiloh in the floor. So that helps us feel very confident about this being the site of Shiloh. So that is one of the places you can go. If you want to know more about some of the things at Shiloh and the things that they're doing, get on the internet and search for Dr. Scott Stripling, archaeologist at Shiloh. And there are some interviews with some TV networks, and where he talks about the excavations that he's been supervising there for the last several years, and how confident he feels with evidence. They base things upon things such as this inscription. Upon this is very definitely a Hebrew religious site. It was used over an extended period of time. They check the pottery and things like this. Now, Shiloh itself, the city of Shiloh, was one of those cities that the Canaanites already had built when the children of Israel got there. Remember that God said, I will give you cities that you didn't build. Well, when they ran the Canaanites out, they took over the city of Shiloh and made it into their Israelite city, and that's where the tabernacle sat. The tabernacle, as I say, was there for 369 years. Samuel's mother brought him to Eli at Shiloh. Eli probably lived in one of these stone buildings around the tabernacle. He didn't live inside the tabernacle itself, but he was probably living in one of these stone buildings. And so that's what he brought him, and Samuel would have stayed there in that building with Eli. From Shiloh, kind of the demise, the children of Israel take the Ark of the Covenant into battle with the Philistines in 1 Samuel 3. And that was a kind of a significant, this is at the end of the time that the tabernacle was at Shiloh, right before the tabernacle leaves Shiloh. We know the Ark was captured, and then Phinehas and Hophni, the two sons of Eli, were killed in the battle. The news comes back to Eli. He's sitting in the gate chamber, or at the gate. And he falls over backwards and apparently breaks his neck or something and dies. They have also found the gate and the chamber that the ruler of the city would have sat in, or would have. One of the common things were for their cities, but if you came to a city, it was kind of like their court area or something. You could come there and you could get decisions, or you could come there, and Eli was sitting at the gate, it says in Samuel. And so they have found the gate of the city of Shiloh where Eli was sitting. And I don't think I've got a picture in this set of slides. Phinehas's wife dies in childbirth right after Eli dies. The whole thing upsets her, so she has her child. And this is 1 Samuel 4 and verse 21. She called the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken, and because of her father-in-law and her husband." She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken." What did the ark of God represent? Represented the glory of God. They have carried it off to Israel, and now the glory of God, the thing that was God's presence with them, that was to protect them, to lead them, is gone, and Shiloh is destroyed. It doesn't tell us in the scriptures. Actually, Samuel ends basically with her statement. But archaeologists have dug around and found that the Philistines burned Shiloh. Also, if we go to Jeremiah, the 7th chapter, verses 12 to 14, and I had never noticed this until I went there. He says, this is before the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah is trying to get Israel or Judah to repent. He says, "Go now to my place which was in Shiloh," where the tabernacle was, "and where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people of Israel." Were they wicked? Well, they carried the ark off into battle. "And now because you have done all these things, declares the Lord," speaking to the people in Jeremiah's day, "and I spoke to you rising up early and speaking, but you did not hear. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, I will go to the house which is called by my name," speaking of Solomon's temple, "in which you trust, and to the place which I gave you and your fathers, and as I did to Shiloh." Jeremiah is suggesting, go look at Shiloh. I destroyed it. God's glory, when God's glory left Shiloh because of their sins, he destroyed Shiloh. Also, Psalm 78 verse 58 to 60 says, "When God heard, he was filled with wrath and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he abandoned the dwelling place in Shiloh, the tent which he had pitched among men." He abandoned Shiloh, and of course we know when God leaves a place, he leaves it unprotected. Archaeologists have found evidence that Shiloh was burned by the Philistines. The Jewish tradition from their Talmud says that Shiloh and the tabernacle were destroyed. Now, from my study, I'm going to just have a difference of opinion on that. I don't think the tabernacle was destroyed. I do think the permanent foundations and the permanent pieces of the tabernacle were destroyed, because I'm going to suggest to you a little further here that the tabernacle itself was salvaged and moved to another place. The glory has gone from Shiloh, but it's still in the Ark of the Covenant, because in 1 Samuel 6 verse 19, after it comes back from the Philistines, it comes on that cart with the oxen leading it. It comes to Beth Shemesh, and what do the people of Beth Shemesh do? They look into the ark, and nobody was supposed to look into the ark, and they died because they looked. And so that, to me, that indicates the glory of the Lord was still with the ark. at this time. And then they take the ark up to Abinadab's house in 1 Samuel 7, and Abinadab prospers because he has been blessed by the ark being there. Abinadab lived in Kiriath Jearim in a house of on a hill. Well, this photo is the hill of Kiriath Jearim. We were not allowed to go up there because it's private property and there's not anything there. But that's where they think that Abinadab's house was and where the ark was from the time it came back from the Philistines until David took it to Jerusalem. So the Ark of the Covenant still has the glory of the Lord. It is now separated from the tabernacle, and it is at Kiriath Jearim. The tabernacle appears to go to Nob. Nob is a town that's let me back up. Shiloh was in the tribe of Ephraim. And many think that it was in Shiloh because Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim, and think that's why the tabernacle was there. The tabernacle now goes to Nob, which is in the tribe of Benjamin. And we base that upon a couple of things. In 1 Samuel, the 21st chapter, verses 1 through 6, David eats consecrated bread from before the Lord. That's in Nob that he does that. So the tabernacle must have been salvaged from Shiloh when the Philistines were coming. The priest must have packed it up and brought it to Nob and set it up there, because David now comes and he eats the consecrated bread there. In 1 Samuel 22, verses 14 through 21, Saul gets mad at the priest because they've helped David, and he tries to get his troops to kill the priest. And they will not, but he has Doeg, who is a foreigner. And Doeg has no problem killing all the priests living at Nob because they have helped David. David brought the ark to Jerusalem and placed it in a tent in 1 Samuel 6 and verse 17. So it comes from Abinadab's house at Kiriath Jearim down to Jerusalem. And in the 1 Chronicles 21 verses 28 to 29, we see that the tabernacle is in Gibeon because Solomon goes up to Gibeon to offer a sacrifice there. Well, and also in 1 Chronicles 21, David mentions that's a passage that mentions that David did not have time to go to Gibeon to offer a sacrifice. He had to offer the sacrifice in Jerusalem to stay the angel of the Lord. He did not have time to go to the tabernacle in Gibeon. So based on that, and in 2 Chronicles 1 and verse 3 through 7, Solomon went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices to the Lord when he was anointed king. And so from that, we conclude the tabernacle goes from Nob up to Gibeon. And it seems to have been at these two places about 59 or 60 years in time. So we have the tabernacle goes from Gilgal up to Shiloh. The Ark of the Covenant goes to the Philistines. And then the tabernacle goes to Nob. The ark comes back to Shemesh, and the people there look in it, and then they send it on to Kiriath Jearim. And then then the tabernacle moves from Nob up to Gibeon, and then the ark goes to Jerusalem. Then finally Solomon brings the tabernacle to Jerusalem when he refinishes the temple. So that's kind of the movement of the tabernacle, and And I thought that was interesting, and my trip caused me to be interested in that, to see where the tabernacle was and how it was used. But the presence of God was always in that period of time with them in physical form in the Ark of the Covenant. And so now it goes to the temple. Solomon built this temple in Jerusalem. There's a whole lot said about the temple, how magnificent it was. I couldn't get a picture of it because Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the pictures. And so we have this drawing that someone made of what the temple might have looked like. And in First Chronicles 5:5, it says they brought up the ark and the tent of meeting and all the holy utensils which were in the tent. The Levitical priests brought them up. And then it says that the ark was placed in the Holy of Holies. So now that which represents the presence of God is now in the temple in Jerusalem. And we know what happened after the ark is placed in the Holy of Holies. We have that physical manifestation that God recognizes that his presence is in the temple. The smoke fills the temple. And so we have that physical manifestation of the presence of God. Now, I'm only halfway through. I have 46 slides, just so y'all will know, and I'm up to about 25. So that 5-minute warning is kind of bad. So over the next 400 years, the Ark of the Covenant ends up, and then put all the I assume that all those storerooms around the temple, they must have put all the pieces of the tabernacle in those storerooms. There was a lot of gold and stuff in that tabernacle because the side walls were plated with gold. And so I guess they stored that. But over the next 400 years, and again, a round number, from the time that Solomon builds the temple till Nebuchadnezzar comes, the nation divides, abandons God, begins idol worship, and in Ezekiel 10 verse 18, a passage we're very familiar with, the glory of God leaves the temple. The same thing that happened to the tabernacle. The glory of God was out of the tabernacle, and the tabernacle site was destroyed. Now we know what happened. The Babylonians burned Jerusalem and the temple because the glory of God was gone from the temple. His presence with them was gone. They spend 70 years in captivity without a temple or without a tabernacle. And I will make one mention at this point. The last time I can find in the scriptures that the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned is when Solomon has the priest to take the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. I can't find it mentioned after that. So I have no idea what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. It was probably taken by one of the foreign nations, either Egypt or Babylon, who ransacked the temple in the time, in that 400-year period there. Ezra and Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple. And we remember Kevin covered that Sunday, many of the old people wept. And Haggai says in Haggai 2 that they wept because, and he says, look at, it's not like the other temple was. I think there's one thing significant in verse 5 there. He says, as for the promise which I made you when you came out of Egypt, my spirit is abiding in your midst. Do not fear. When they come back from the Babylonian captivity, they don't have the ark, they don't have the tabernacle, they build a temple. In Ezekiel, the presence of God left. They don't have the physical manifestation left there. They don't have a physical manifestation or an item that represents the presence of God. But what does God say? My spirit is abiding in your midst. That is a New Testament idea that we see here, I think, in Haggai's prophecy. Because when you go, we're going to look at the rest of it in just a minute. From Ezra to shortly before Christ, approximately another 400 years. This temple that Ezra and his group built, it gets profaned by the Greeks. It gets renovated and expanded by the Jews, but it's still not the temple compared to what Solomon had. Then just before Christ came, a fellow named Herod the Great, who was one of the greatest builders of the Roman times, comes on the scene, and he built an amazing temple for the Jews. To me, it's ironic. Herod the Great tried to kill Jesus when he was a baby or child, but he built a temple. He didn't know it was for Jesus, but he built a temple for Jesus for the glory of God to come into. If that's not ironic, you see how many times does God take an evil ruler and he's trying his best to destroy something that God is doing, and God reverses it on him. Well, Herod the Great built this great temple for Jesus to come into. And this is a picture of the model of the temple, and I'm obviously not going to have time to cover it all. This temple itself is about the same size as the temple that Solomon built. But this model does not give it justice, because the platform area of the temple, which Herod the Great built, was twice as big as the platform that was in Jerusalem. Solomon had about 16 acres in the temple compound. Herod the Great had in the temple compound some 35 or 36 acres. The increase in the temple compound, and I think, again, this is ironic, was the court of the Gentiles. Now, if you don't think that, I think that's interesting to me. And so it's like Herod the Great was opening up the religion for the Gentiles. And I just think that's interesting. These are the areas that Jesus would have taught in these porches around the colonnaded porches around the temple when he was there. Probably in the stoa over here is where they were selling the animals that Jesus turns over their tables. The temple itself that Herod built, and I'm just going to go a couple more minutes. When Jesus and his disciples are coming out of the temple, in Mark the 13th chapter, the disciples looked back and the sun would have been shining on that temple near the end of the day, and said, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what a wonderful building." So remember what the people said in Ezra's day, how disappointed they were. Now they've got a magnificent temple. The temple Herod built was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world by many. And Josephus, a historian from that era, he said the exterior of the building lacked nothing that could astound either mind or eye. To approaching strangers, it appeared from a distance like a snow-clad mountain, for all that was not clad with gold was of purest white. Now, what I want to suggest to you, that God influenced Herod to build something that was suitable for his Son of glory to come into, for the glory of God to come into. Now, I'm running out of time here. This is kind of a picture of what the court of Gentiles would be. You see how large that is. You could set in the temple, set in the center of this, and you could set Commonwealth Stadium on either side of that temple in the court of the Gentiles, which extended to both sides. I guess I'll need to quit there. I've got several other pictures I share with you. This is a part of the magnificence of the temple that Herod built was the large stones that he put in that temple. Some of the stones weighed over 350 tons, and they are perfectly flat and square, so that when he lays them together, they perfectly lay one on top of the other, and you cannot slide a sheet of paper between the stones anywhere. And that's part of the magnificence of the temple he built. So I do think that God calls this to happen so he'd have an appropriate place for his son, for his glory to come. But what happens to the temple? When the Jews reject Jesus, I credit John 12th chapter when Jesus is telling them, and he talks about that he is going to, they bring him into this is when they bring him into glory into the temple. But the tide turns when Jesus tells them he is going to die. And they ask the question, who is this man? They had been all happy about Jesus being the king coming to his temple. And then when he was not what they wanted, they said, who is this man? And that's the beginning of their rejection, the crowd rejecting Jesus. Well, when you reject the glory of God, what happens to your temple? Well, just about 30 years after this, the Babylonians destroy the temple down to the ground. Now, the retaining walls around the temple grounds are still there, and they're very interesting. So I'm going to quit with that. I'll probably talk a little bit more about the temple grounds and things in a future class. Thank you. I'm going to have to get it down to less than 45 slides, I guess.